Alright, my little ones, it's bedtime. Got your pajamas on, teeth brushed, get down into bed, lie down and get comfortable. Tonight, we're going to be reading a story that you're familiar with, but this is the story that inspired the movie Frozen with the princesses, or the Queen Elsa and her sister Queen Anna. But it's going to be different than what you think. So, before we begin, I'll take in a deep breath. And let it out. Alright, let us begin. The Snow Queen, a tale in 7 stories. First story, which is about the mirror and its pieces. Alright, now let's begin. When we reach the end of the story, we will know more than we know now, because there was an evil troll. He was one of the very worst. He was the devil. One day he was in a truly good mood, because he had created a mirror that had the power to make everything good and beautiful that was reflected in it shrink to almost nothing, while whatever was worthless and loathsome would stand out clearly and look even worse. In the mirror, the loveliest landscape looked like boiled spinach, and the best people turned beastly or stood on their heads with no stomachs. Their faces became so distorted that they were beyond recognition, and if you had a freckle, you could be sure that it would spread over your nose and mouth. That was excellent fun, said the devil. If a good, pious thought passed through someone's mind, a smirk would appear in the mirror, and the troll demon would have to laugh at his ingenious invention. Everyone who attended troll school, because he ran a troll school, told everyone else that a miracle had occurred. For the first time, they said it was possible to see how the world and human beings actually looked. They ran around with the mirror, and in the end there wasn't a country or a person that hadn't been distorted by it. Then they even wanted to fly up to heaven itself to ridicule the angels and our Lord. The higher they flew with the mirror, the more it smirked. They could hardly hold on to it. Higher and higher they flew, closer to God and the angels. Then the mirror began trembling so terribly as it smirked that it flew out of their hands and plummeted to earth, where it broke into 100 million billion pieces and more. And that was precisely the reason why it did even more harm than before, because some of the pieces were hardly bigger than a grain of sand. They flew around in the world, and whenever they landed in someone's eye, that's where they would stay. These people would see everything wrong, or only have eyes for what was bad in something. Since every little speck of mirror had kept the same powers that the whole mirror possessed, some people even got a little piece of mirror in their heart, and then it was quite dreadful. The heart would turn into a lump of ice. Some pieces of mirror were so big that they were used for window panes, which is just a nice word for a window, like the glass in the windows. But it wasn't worth looking into those panes to see your friends. Other pieces ended up in the eyeglasses, and then things would go badly when the person put on the glasses to see properly and fairly. The evil one laughed until his belly split. It tickled him so splendidly. But outside, little pieces of glass were still flying around in the air. Now, let's hear what happened. Second story, a little boy and a little girl. In the big city, where there were so many buildings and people that there wasn't enough room for everyone to have a little garden, and where the most people have to be content with flowers in pots, there were two poor children who did have a garden that was slightly bigger than a flower pot. They were not brother and sister, yet they were as fond of each other as if they had been. Their families lived right next door to each other. They lived in two garret rooms, at the place where the roof of one building touched the roof of the other, and the gutter ran along the eaves. A little window jutted out from each building. All you had to do was step over the gutter to go from one window to the other. Outside, each family had a big wooden box, and it grew herbs for cooking and a little rose bush. There was one in each pot. They grew so wondrously. Then their parents decided to set the boxes atop the gutter so they might almost reach from one window to the other, and looked exactly like two flower beds. Pea vines hung down the sides of the boxes, and the rose bushes sprouted long branches that twined around the windows and bent toward each other. It was almost like a triumphal arch of greenery and blossoms. Since the boxes were quite high and the children knew that they weren't supposed to crawl out, they were often allowed to climb out the windows to each other and sit on their little stools beneath the roses. That's where they played so happily. In the winter, of course, that amusement would come to an end. The windows were often completely frosted over, but then they would heat up copper skillings on the stove, place the hot skillings on the frozen window pane, and then a lovely peephole would appear, so round. So round. Through it a blessed, gentle eye would peek, one in each window. It was the little boy and the little girl. His name was Kai, and hers was Gerda. In the summer they could reach each other with a single bound. In the winter they first had to go down all those stairs, and then come up all those other stairs. Outside the snow swirled in drifts. "The white bees are swarming," said old grandmother. "Do they have a queen bee too?" asked the little boy, because he knew that real bees had one. "Yes, they do," said grandmother. "She flies in the thick of the swarm. She's the biggest of them all, and she never rests on the ground. She flies up once inside the black cloud. Many a winter night she flies through the city streets, peering in the windows, and then they frost over so strangely, looking like flowers." "Oh yes, we've seen that," said both children, so they knew it must be true. "Can the Snow Queen come inside?" asked the little girl. "Just let her come in," said the boy, "and I'll put her on the hot stove, and then she'll melt." But grandmother stroked his hair and told him other stories. One evening when little Kai was home and almost undressed, he climbed up onto the chair by the window and peeked out the little hole. A few snowflakes were falling outside, and one of them, the biggest of all, remained lying on the edge of one of the flower boxes. The snowflake grew bigger and bigger until it became at last a whole woman dressed in the sheerest white gossamer, which looked as if it were made of a million star-like flakes. She was so beautiful and elegant, but made of ice, dazzling, glittering ice. And yet she was alive. Her eyes were like two bright stars, but there was nothing calm or peaceful about them. She nodded at the window and waved her hand. The little boy was terrified and jumped down from the chair. Then it seemed as if a huge bird flew past the outside window. The next day was cold and bright. And then came spring. The sun shone, green sprouts appeared, the swallows built their nests, the windows were flung open, and the little children once again sat in their tiny garden high in the eaves at the very top of the buildings. That summer the roses bloomed so marvelously. The little girl had learned a hymn that spoke of roses, and those roses made her think of her own. She sang it for the little boy, and he sang along. "In the valley where roses grow wild, there we will speak to the Christ child." And the children held each other's hands kissed the roses, and looked into God's bright sunshine, speaking to it as if the Christ child were there. How lovely the summer days were! How heavenly to be outside near the fresh rose bushes that never seemed to stop blooming. Kai and Gerda sat looking at a picture book with animals and birds. That was when, just as the clock struck 5 on the big church tower, Kai said, "Ouch! Something stabbed me in the heart, and now I have something in my eye." The little girl put her arm around his neck. He blinked his eyes. No, there was nothing to be seen. "I think it's gone," he said. But it was not gone. It was one of those specks of glass that came from the mirror, the troll mirror. Of course we remember it, the horrid glass that made everything great and good that was reflected in it become small and hideous, while the evil and wicked appeared quite clearly, and every fault that anything possessed was noticed at once. Poor Kai! He had also gotten a speck right in the heart, which would soon turn into a lump of ice. At the moment it didn't hurt, but it was there. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "It makes you look so horrid. There's nothing wrong with me. Ugh!" he suddenly shouted. "That rose over there has been gnawed by a worm. And look, that one is completely crooked. These roses are actually quite disgusting. They look like the boxes they're standing in." And then he kicked the box hard with his foot and tore off 2 of the roses. "Kai, what are you doing?" cried the little girl. And when he saw her horror, he tore off another rose and then dashed through his window away from blessed little Gerda. Later, when she brought out the picture book, he said it was for babies, and if grandmother had told him stories, he would always come up with some objection. Whenever he had the chance, he would walk behind her, putting on glasses and talking the way she did. It was a perfect likeness, and then people would laugh at him. Soon he could talk and talk like everyone else on the whole street. Everything that was odd about them and unattractive, Kai could imitate. Then people said, "Hopefully he certainly has a clever head on his shoulders, that boy." But it was the glass that had landed in his eye, and the glass that sat in his heart. They were the reason he teased even little Gerda, who loved him with all her soul. The games he played were now very different from before. They were so logical. One winter day, as the snowflakes swirled in drifts, he brought out a big magnifying glass, held out a corner of his blue coat, and let the flakes land on it. "Look into the glass, Gerda," he said, and every snowflake grew much bigger, looking like a magnificent flower or a 10-pointed star. It was lovely to see. "Do you see how ingenious they are? They're much more interesting than real flowers. None of them have a single flaw. They're quite perfect, as long as they don't melt." A little while later, Kai appeared wearing big gloves and carrying his sled on his back. He shouted right into Gerda's ear, "I have permission to go sledding at the big square where the others are playing." And off he went. Over in the square, the most daring of the boys would often tie their sleds to the farmer's wagon, and then they would ride along for a good stretch down the road. They were having a merry time in the midst of their games. A huge sleigh appeared. It was painted all white, and in it sat someone swathed in a shaggy white fur and wearing a shaggy white cap. The sleigh circled the square twice, and Kai quickly tied his little sled to it. Then he was riding along. The sleigh went faster and faster, right into the next street. The person who was driving turned around and nodded in such a friendly way at Kai, as if they knew each other. Each time Kai tried to untie his little sled, the person would nod again, and then Kai stayed where he was. They drove right out through the city gates. Then the snow began to come down so heavily that the little boy couldn't see his hand in front of him, but he kept racing along. He hastily let go of the rope to get away from the huge sled, but it was no good. His little sled hung on, moving with the speed of the wind. Then he shouted quite loudly, but no one heard him. The snow swirled in drifts, and the sleigh sped along. Once in a while it would give a hop, as if flying over ditches and fences. Kai was quite terrified. He wanted to say the Lord's Prayer, but all he could remember was his multiplication tables. The snowflakes grew bigger and bigger until at last they looked like a big white hen. Suddenly they leaped aside. The huge sleigh came to a halt, and the person who was driving it stood up. The fur coat and cap were nothing but snow. It was a woman, standing so tall and straight, so shimmering white. It was the Snow Queen. "We've made good progress," she said, "but aren't you freezing? Crawl under my bearskin," she said. Set him in the sleigh beside her, wrapping the bearskin around him. He felt as if he were sinking into a snowdrift. "Are you still freezing?" she asked, and then she kissed him on the forehead. Oh, it was colder than ice. It went right to his heart, which was already half ice. He felt as if he would die, but only for a moment, and then he felt fine. He no longer noticed the cold all around him. "My sled! Don't forget my sled!" That was the first thing he thought of, and so it was tied onto one of the white hens, which flew along behind with the sled on its back. The Snow Queen kissed Kai again, and then he forgot all about little Gerda and grandmother and everyone else back home. "No more kisses for you," she said, "or I might kiss you to death." Kai looked at her. She was so beautiful. He couldn't imagine a wiser, a lovelier face. She no longer seemed made of ice, as she had when she sat outside the window and beckoned to him. To his eyes, she now seemed perfect. He was not the least bit afraid. He told her that he could do his figures in his head, even with fractions, or how many square miles each country had, and how many inhabitants, and she kept on smiling. Then he thought that what he knew was not nearly enough. He looked up at the vast, vast sky, and she flew along with him, flew high up into the black cloud, and the storm rumbled and roared, as if it were singing ancient ballads. They flew over forests and lakes, over sea and land. Beneath them rushed the cold wind. The wolves howled, the snow sparkled, and over it flew shrieking black crows. But up above, the moon glowed big and bright, and Kai gazed at it all night. That long, long winter night. In the daytime he slept at the Snow Queen's feet. Third story, The Flower Garden of the Woman Who Knew Magic. But how did little Gerda feel when Kai didn't come back? Where was he? No one knew. No one could tell her. The boys said only that they had seen him tie his little sled to a magnificent huge sleigh that drove down the street and out the city gates. No one knew where he was. Many tears fell. Little Gerda wept so hard and so long. Then they said that he was dead. He had drowned in the river that ran close to the city. Oh, those were such long and dark winter days. Then came spring with warmer sunshine. "Kai is dead and gone," said little Gerda. "I don't believe it," said the sunshine. "He's dead and gone," she told the swallows. "We don't believe it," they replied, and in the end Gerda didn't believe it either. "I'll put on my new red shoes," she said one morning. "Kai has never seen them, and then I'll go down to the river and ask about him." It was very early. She kissed old grandmother, who was sleeping, put on her red shoes, and walked all alone out the gates to the river. "Is it true that you've taken my little playmate? I'll give you my red shoes if you'll give him back to me." And it seemed to her that the waves nodded quite strangely. Then she picked up her red shoes, her dearest possessions, and threw both of them into the river. But they fell close to the shore, and the little waves promptly brought them back to her on land, as if the river didn't want to take her dearest possessions, since it didn't have little Kai. But she thought that she hadn't thrown them far enough, so she climbed into a boat that was floating among the reeds. She went all the way out to the farthest end and threw the shoes, but the boat wasn't tied securely, and with her movement it glided away from land. She noticed this and hurried to get out. Before she could make her way back, the boat was more than 2 feet from shore, and it began to slip away even faster. Then little Gerda grew quite frightened and started to cry, but no one heard her except the sparrows. They couldn't carry her back to land, but they flew along the shore and sang as if to comfort her, "We are here! We are here!" The boat drifted with the current, and little Gerda sat quite still in her stocking feet. Her little red shoes floated along behind, but they couldn't reach the boat. It was picking up speed. It was beautiful on both banks, with lovely flowers, old trees, and sheep and cows on the slopes, but not a person in sight. "Maybe the river will take me to little Kai," thought Gerda, and then her spirits rose. She stood up and for many hours looked at the beautiful green banks. Then she came to a big cherry orchard. There stood a little house that had strange red and blue windows, as well as a thatched roof. Outside stood 2 wooden soldiers who presented arms for all who sailed past. Gerda called to them. She thought they were alive, but of course they didn't answer. She came quite close to them, and the river lifted the boat toward land. Gerda shouted even louder, and then out of the house came an old woman, leaning on a crooked stick. She was wearing a big sun hat that was painted with the loveliest flowers. "You poor child," said the old woman. "How did you end up in that big strong current, drifting far away out into the wide world?" And then the old woman came right out into the water, hooked her crooked stick on the boat, pulled it ashore, and lifted out little Gerda. Gerda was glad to be on dry land, yet she was a little afraid of the strange old woman. "Come here and tell me who you are and how you happened to get here," she said. Gerda told her everything, and the old woman shook her head and said, "My, my." After Gerda had told her everything and had asked whether she had seen little Kai, the woman said that he had not come past, but no doubt he would. She shouldn't be so sad, but have a taste of her cherries and look at her flowers. They were more beautiful than any picture book. Each of them could tell a whole story. Then she took Gerda by the hand. They went inside the little house, and the old woman locked the door. The windows were high up with panes that were red, blue, and yellow. The daylight shone so strangely inside, for all those colors. On the table were the loveliest cherries, and Gerda ate as many as she liked, because she was no longer afraid. While she ate, the old lady combed her hair with a golden comb, and her hair curled and gleamed such a lovely yellow all around her cheerful little face, which was so round and looked like a rose. "Oh, how I've longed for such a sweet little girl," said the old woman. "Now you'll see how well the 2 of us will get along." And as she combed little Gerda's hair, Gerda forgot more and more about Kai, who was like a brother, because the old woman knew magic. Although she was not a bad witch, she merely did a little conjuring of her own amusement, and now she wanted to keep little Gerda. That's why she went into the garden, stretched out a crooked stick toward all the rose bushes, and no matter how lovely their blossoms, every one of them sank into the black earth. It was impossible to tell where they stood. The old woman was afraid that when Gerda saw the roses, she would think about her own, remember little Kai, and run off. Then she let Gerda out of the flower garden. Oh, what a fragrance! What loveliness there was! Every imaginable flower from every season of the year that stood there in full bloom. No picture book could be more colorful or beautiful. Gerda jumped for joy and played until the sun went down behind the tall cherry trees. Then she was given a lovely bed with red silk comforters filled with blue violets, and she slept and dreamed as blissfully as any queen on her wedding day. The next day she played again with the flowers in the warm sunshine. In that manner many days passed. Gerda knew every flower, but no matter how many there were, she still thought that one must be missing, though she didn't know which one it might be. Then one day she was sitting and looked at the old woman's sun hat with the painted flowers, and the most beautiful of all was a rose. The old woman had forgot to remove it from her hat when she put the others into the ground. That's what happens when you don't have your wits about you." "What?" said Gerda. "Aren't there any roses here?" And she leapt among the flower beds, searching and searching, but there was not one to be found. Then she sat down and wept, but her hot tears fell on the very spot where a rose bush had vanished. When the hot tears watered the earth, the bush suddenly shot up, as full of blossoms as when it sank. Gerda embraced the bush, kissed the roses, and thought about the lovely roses back home, and then about little Kai. "Oh, how long have I lingered?" said the little girl. "I was supposed to find Kai." Do any of you know where he is?" she asked the roses. "Do you think he's dead and gone?" "Well, he's not dead," said the roses. "We've been in the ground where all the dead are, but Kai wasn't there." "Oh, thank you," said little Gerda, and she went over to the other flowers and looked inside their chalices, then asked, "Do you know where little Kai is?" But each flower stood in the sun, dreaming of its own tale or story. Little Gerda heard so many of them, but no one knew anything about Kai. What did the little fire lily say? "Do you hear the drum? Bam, bam. It only beats two. Always bam, bam. Listen to the women's mournful song. Listen to the shouts of the priests. In her long red gown the Hindu woman stands on the pyre. The flames leap up around her and her dead husband. But the Hindu woman is thinking of the man who is alive here in the crowd. The man whose eyes burn hotter than flames. The man whose fiery eyes reach deeper into her heart than the blaze that will soon burn her body to ashes. Can the flame of the heart die in the flames of the pyre?" "I don't understand that at all," said little Gerda. "That's my tale," said the fire lily. "What does the morning glory say?"
Above the narrow mountain road perches an old baronial castle. The dense periwinkles twine around the ancient red walls, leaf upon leaf, over to the balcony. That's where a lovely girl stands. She's bending over the railing and gazing upon the road. No rose hangs fresher from its branches than she. No apple blossom, when the wind lifts it from the tree, floats lighter than she. How her magnificent silk gown rustles. Will he never come?"
"Is Kai the one you mean?" asked little Gerda.
"I'm only telling you my tale, my dream,"
replied the morning glory. "What does the little snowdrop say?" "Between the trees a long board hangs from ropes. It's a swing. Two charming little girls. Their dresses as white as snow. Long green silk ribbons fluttering from their hats. Are sitting there, swinging. Their brother, who is bigger than they are, is standing on the swing. He has one arm hooked around the rope to hold on, because in one hand he has a little bowl, and the other a clay pipe. He's blowing soap bubbles. The swing sways, the bubbles fly with lovely shifting colors. The last one is still clinging to the stem of the pipe, quivering in the wind. The swing sways. The little black dog, as light as the bubbles, stands on his hind legs to get up on the swing. The swing flies. The dog falls, barking and angry. They're teasing him. The bubbles burst. A swinging board, a leaping froth picture. That is my song. Your story may be a beautiful one, but you tell it so mournfully, and you don't mention Kai at all. What do the hieroglyphics mean?" There are three lovely sisters, so transparent and delicate. The gown of one sister was red, the second sister's was blue, and the third sister's was pure white. Hand in hand they danced by the quiet lake in the bright moonlight. They were not elf girls, they were human children. There was such a sweet fragrance, and the girls disappeared into the forest. The fragrance grew stronger. 3 coffins, in which the lovely girls lay, glided from the depths of the forest out across the lake. Shimmering fireflies flitted around like tiny hovering lights. Are the dancing girls asleep, or are they dead? The fragrance of flowers says that they are corpses. The evening bell tolls for the dead. "You make me sad," said little Gerda. "Your fragrance is so strong that it makes me think of the dead girls. Oh, is little Kai dead after all? The roses were inside the earth, and they say no. Ding dong, rang the bell of the Hyacinths. We're not ringing for little Kai. We don't know him at all. We're just singing our song, the only one we know. And Gerda went over to the buttercup, which shone among the glistening green leaves. You're a bright little sun, said Gerda. Tell me if you know where I can find my playmate. And the buttercup shone so beautifully and looked at Gerda. What song would the buttercup sing? But it was not about Kai either. In the little courtyard shone our Lord's sun, so warm on the first day of spring. Its rays slide down the white wall of the neighbor's house. Close by grew the first yellow flowers, gleaming gold in the warm sunshine. The old grandmother was sitting outside in her chair. Her granddaughter, the poor, enchanting servant girl, had come home for a short visit. She kissed her grandmother. There was gold, the heart's gold, in that blessed kiss. Gold on her lips, gold in the ground, gold up above in the morning hour. See, that's my little story, said the buttercup. Poor old grandmother, sighed Gerda. Oh, she must miss me. She must be grieving for me, just as she did for little Kai. But I'll soon go back home, and I'll bring Kai with me. It's no use asking the flowers. They only know their own songs. They can't tell me anything. Then she tucked up her little dress so she could run faster. But the narcissus struck her across the leg as she jumped over it. She stopped, looked at the tall yellow flower, and asked, Do you happen to know anything? She bent all the way down to the narcissus. And what did it say? I can see myself. I can see myself, said the narcissus. Oh, how fragrant I am. Up in the tiny garret room stands a little dancer, half dressed. She stands first on one leg, then on two. She kicks at the whole world. She's in an illusion. She pours water from the teapot onto a piece of cloth she's holding. It's a corset. Cleanliness is a good thing. The white dress hangs on a hook. It too has been washed in the teapot and dried on the roof. She puts it on, and the saffron yellow scarf around her neck makes the dress shine even whiter. Her leg in the air. See how proudly she sways on one stalk? I can see myself. I can see myself. I don't like that one bit, said Gerda. What kind of story is that? And then she ran to the edge of the garden. The door was closed, but she wiggled the rusty latch until it came loose, and the door flew open. Then little Gerda ran barefoot out into the wide world. She looked back 3 times, but no one came after her. At last she could run no further and sat down on a big rock. When she looked around, summer was over. It was late autumn. She hadn't noticed this at all inside the lovely garden, where the sun always shone, and there were flowers from every season of the year. How long have I lingered? Said little Gerda. It's already fall. This is no time to rest. And she stood up to go. Oh, how tender and sore were her little feet, and everything around her looked cold and raw. The long willow trees had turned quite yellow, and drops of fog dipped from them. One leaf fell after another. Only the blackthorn still bore fruit, tart enough to pucker your lips. Oh, how gray and dreary it was in the wide world. Fourth story, The Prince and the Princess. Gerda had to rest again. Then right across from where she was sitting, a big crow landed in the snow. He had been sitting and watching her for a long time, wagging his head. Now he said, Caw, caw, go dog, go dog. He couldn't say goodbye any better than that, but he meant that the little girl well and asked her where she was going. All alone out in the wide world. The word alone was something that Gerda understood quite well, and had felt what it meant firsthand. So she told the crow all about her life and asked him whether he had seen Kai. The crow nodded rather thoughtfully and said, That could be. What? Have you really? Cried the little girl, and practically crushed the crow to death. She kissed him so hard. Be sensible, said the crow. I think I know I think I might be little Kai." But now he seemed to have forgotten. But now he seems to have forgotten you in favor of the princess." "Does he live with the princess?" asked Gerda. "Just listen," said the crow. "But it's hard for me to speak her language. If you understand crow speak, I can speak things much better." "No, I never learned it," said Gerda. "But grandmother can speak it, and she knows P-talk too. If only I had learned it." "Doesn't matter," said the crow. "I'll try to tell you as best I can, but I'm going to do a poor job of it." And then he told her what he knew. "In the kingdom where we now find ourselves, there lives a princess who is terribly clever. She has read all the newspapers that exist in the world and forgotten them again. That's how clever she is. The other day she was sitting on the throne, and they say that's not especially amusing, and she happened to hum a song, the one that goes, 'Why shouldn't I marry?' You know, there's something to that," she said. "And then she decided to get married. But she wants a husband who knows how to respond when spoken to, someone who just won't stand there looking elegant, because that's just too boring." So she gathered all her ladies in waiting, and when they heard what she had in mind, they were quite pleased. "We like that," they said. "We were thinking about that very thing the other day. You can trust me that every word I say is true," said the crow. "I have a tame sweetheart who has allowed me to move freely through the palace, and she has told me everything." Of course, his sweetheart was also a crow, for crows seek their equals, and they are always crows. "The newspapers are printed at once with a border of hearts and the monogram of the princess. There you can read that any good-looking young man was welcome to come up to the palace and speak with the princess. The one who spoke so it was clear that he felt at home. The man who spoke the best was the one the princess would take as her husband." "Oh, yes," said the crow. "You can believe what I tell you. It's as true as I'm sitting here. Men came swarming. There was a great hubbub and commotion, but with no success, either on the first day or the second. They could all speak well when they were out in the street, but as soon as they entered the palace's gates and saw the royal guards dressed in silver, and the footmen dressed in gold standing along the stairs, and the great illuminated halls, then they were struck dumb. And if they stood in front of the throne where the princess sat, they couldn't think of a thing to say except for the last word she had uttered, and she didn't care to hear herself repeated. It was as if the men's bellies had been filled with snuff inside the palace, and they fell into a daze until they came back out into the street. Then they had no trouble talking. A line stretched from the city gates all the way to the palace. I went there to see it myself," said the crow. "They were hungry and thirsty, but from the palace they received not so much as a glass of lukewarm water. Some of the cleverest did bring sandwiches along, but they refused to share with their neighbor. They thought, 'Look at him, let him look hungry. Then the princess won't choose him.'" "But what about Kai, little Kai?" asked Gerda. "When did he arrive? Was he there in the crowd?" Give me time. I'm just getting to him. It was on the third day that a little man arrived, without a horse or carriage, and marched quite boldly right up to the palace. His eyes shone like yours. He had lovely long hair, but his clothes were in tatters." "That was Kai!" Gerda rejoiced. "Oh, at last I found him!" And she clapped her hands. "He had a little knapsack on his back," said the crow. "No, that must have been his sleigh," said Gerda, "because he left with his sled." "That could be," said the crow. "I didn't look very closely, but I know from my tame sweetheart that when he went through the palace gates and saw the royal guards dressed in silver and the footmen dressed in gold standing along the stairs, he wasn't the least bit daunted. He nodded and said to them, 'It must be boring to stand on the stairs. I'd much rather go inside.' There the halls were ablaze with light. There the privy councillors and excellencies walked around barefoot, carrying gold platters. It was enough to intimidate anyone. The creaks of his boots were terribly loud, and yet he wasn't afraid." "It must have been Kai," said Gerda. "I know that he had new boots. I've heard them creak in grandmother's parlor." "And creak they did," said the crow. "He boldly walked right up to the princess, who was sitting on a pearl as big as a spinning wheel. Grouped all around were the ladies in waiting.
with their maids, and the maids of their maids, and all the chamberlains with their servants, and the servants of their servants, who all have pages. And the closer they stood to the door, the more haughty they looked. The page of the servant's servants, who always wears slippers, was almost unbearable to look at. So haughty did he seem, standing in the doorway. That must have been terrible, said little Gerda. And yet Kai won the princess? If I weren't a crow, I would have won her myself, even though I'm engaged. He supposedly spoke as well as I do when I speak crow speak. That's what my tame sweetheart told me. He was bold and charming. He hadn't come as a suitor, but simply to listen to the wisdom of the princess, which he found to his liking, and she in turn found him to her liking. I'm sure of it. That was Kai, said Gerda. He was so clever. He could do his figures in his head, even with fractions. Oh, won't you take me inside the palace? Well, that's easy enough to say for you to say, said the crow. But how are we going to do that? I'll have to talk to my tame sweetheart about it. Surely she can advise us, because I must tell you that a little girl like you will never be granted permission to enter to the usual manor. Oh, yes, I will, said Gerda. When Kai finds out that I'm here, he'll come out at once to get me. Wait for me by the stile over there, said the crow as he wagged his head, and then flew off. It was after dark before the crow came back. Caw, caw, he said. I bring you many greetings from your sweetheart, or from my sweetheart, and here's a scrap of bread for you. She took it from the kitchen. There's plenty of bread, and you must be hungry. It's not possible for you to enter the palace. You are barefoot, after all. The guards dressed in silver and the footmen dressed in gold would never permit it. But don't cry. We'll find a way to get you in. My sweetheart knows a little back-way stairway that leads to the bedchamber, and she knows where to find the key. So they went to the garden, along the great promenade, where one leaf fell after another. And when the lights in the palace were put out, one after another, the crow led little Gerda back over to a back door that stood ajar. Oh, how Gerda's heart was pounding with fear and longing. She felt as if she were about to do something wrong, but all she wanted was to find out whether it was little Kai. Oh yes, it had to be him. She could see so vividly his clever eyes, his long hair. She could see so clearly the way that he smiled when they sat under the roses back home. Surely he would be glad to see her, to hear what a long way she had come for his sake, to know how sad they were all at home when he didn't come back. Oh, she felt both fear and joy. Then they were on the stairs. A little lamp was burning atop a cupboard. In the middle of the room stood the tame crow, turning her head to all sides and looking at Gerda, who curtsied as grandmother had taught her. My fiancé has spoken so highly of you, my dear, said the tame crow. Your life story, your vita, is also touching. If you take the lamp, I will lead the way. We're taking the direct route because then we won't meet anyone. I think someone's coming right behind us, said Gerda, as something rushed past her. The shadows on the wall looked like horses with flowing manes and slender legs, hunter boys and gentlemen and ladies on the horseback. Those are just dreams, said the crow. They've come to gather the thoughts of the royal personages for the hunt. All the better, because now you can observe them in bed. But if you win honor and nobility, I expect you to show a grateful heart. That's no way to talk. That's no way to talk, said the crow from the forest. Then they entered the first hall. Its walls were adorned with rose-colored satin and artificial flowers. Here the dreams had already rushed past them. They moved so fast that Gerda had no chance to see the royal personages. One hall was more magnificent than the other. Ah, yes, it could be quite intimidating. And then they were in the bedchamber. The ceiling looked like an enormous palm tree with fronds of glass, precious glass. In the center of the room, hanging from a thick stalk of gold, were two beds. Each one looked like a lily. One was white, and in it lay the princess. The other was red, and that was the one in which Gerda was to look for Kai. She bent back one of the red leaves, and then she saw the nape of a brown neck. Oh, it was Kai! She called his name out quite loudly, holding the lamp over him. The dreams came rushing back on horseback, returning to the room. He awoke, turned his head. It was not little Kai. The prince looked like Kai only from the back of his neck, but young and handsome he certainly was. And from the white lily bed, the princess peeked out and asked what was going on. Then little Gerda began to weep, and told them the whole story and about everything the crows had done for her. "You poor little thing," said the prince and princess, and they praised the crows and said they weren't the least bit angry with them, although they should never do it again. This time, however, they would be given a reward. "Do you want to fly away free?" asked the princess, "or would you like a permanent position as the court crows and be welcome to all the scraps in the kitchen?" And both crows curtsied and asked for a permanent position, because they were thinking of their old age, and said, "It would be good to have something for our golden years," as they put it. And the prince climbed out of his bed to let Gerda sleep in it, because that was the least he could do. She folded her little hands and thought, how good the people and animals are. Then she closed her eyes and slept blissfully. All the dreams came flying back, and this time they looked like God's angels. They were pulling a little sled, and on it sat Kai, nodding. But it was only a dream, and that's why it vanished as soon as she awoke. The next day she was dressed from head to toe in silk and velvet. She was invited to stay at the palace and live comfortably, but she wanted only a little carriage with a horse and a pair of little boots. Then she would be off again into the wide world to look for Kai. And she was given both the boots and a muff. She was dressed exquisitely, and when she was ready to leave, a new carriage made of pure gold was waiting at the door. It bore the coat of arms of the prince and princess shining like a star. The coachman, footmen, and postilions, there were postilions too, wore gold crowns. The prince and princess helped her into the carriage and wished her the best of luck. The forest crow, who was now married, accompanied her for the first 15 miles. He sat beside her because he couldn't bear to ride backward. The other crow stood at the gate and flapped her wings. She wasn't coming along because she had suffered from headaches ever since she had been given a permanent position and had too much to eat. The inside of the coach was lined with sugar pastries, and on the seat were fruits and ginger snaps. "Farewell, farewell," called the prince and princess, and little Gerda wept, and the crow wept. That's how the first miles passed. Then the crow also bid her farewell, and that was the saddest leave-taking of all. He flew up into a tree and flapped his black wings as long as he could see the carriage, which gleamed like the bright sun. Fifth story, The Little Robber Girl. They drove through the dark forest, but the coach shone like a torch. It dazzled the eyes of the robbers, and there was something they couldn't abide. "It's gold! It's gold!" they shouted as they rushed forward, seized the lewd hold of the horses, killed the postilions, the coachman, the footmen, and then yanked a little Gerda out of the carriage. "She's plump. She's charming. She's been fatted up on nut meats," said the old robber hag, who had a long bristly beard and eyebrows that hung down into her eyes. "She's as nice and as fat as a little lamb. Oh, how delicious she's going to taste." And then she pulled out her gleaming knife, which shone so brightly it was terrifying. "Ow!" said the hag all at once. She had been bitten on the ear by her own little daughter, who was hanging on her back, and was so wild and naughty that it was sheer delight. "You insidious child," said the mother, and then she didn't have time to slaughter Gerda. "I want her to play with me," said the little robber girl. "She has to give me her muff and her beautiful dress and sleep with me in my bed." Then she bit her mother again, so the robber hag leaped into the air and spun around, and all the robbers laughed and said, "Look how she's dancing with her brat." "I want to ride in the carriage," said the little robber girl, and she insisted on having her way, because she was so spoiled and stubborn. She and Gerda got into the carriage, and then they drove over stumps and thickets deeper into the forest. The little robber girl was as big as Gerda, but stronger, with wide shoulders and a dark complexion. Her eyes were quite black. They looked almost sad. She put her arm around little Gerda's waist and said, "I won't let them slaughter you as long as you don't make me angry. You're a princess, aren't you?" "No," said little Gerda, and told her all about what she had been through and how much she loved little Kai. The robber girl gave her a somber look, nodded her head slightly, and said, "I won't let them slaughter you, even if you do make me angry. I'll do it myself." And then she dried Gerda's eyes and tucked both of her hands into the beautiful muff, which was so soft and warm. Muff was like a big giant sleeve that you could put your hands in, and normally it was made out of some kind of animal fur. So it's before they, created mittens. Then the carriage came to a halt. There they were in the middle of the courtyard of the robber's castle. It was cracked from top to bottom. Ravens and crows were flying out of the open services. The huge bulldogs, each of which looked as if it could swallow a person whole, were leaping high into the air, but they didn't bark because that was forbidden. Inside the vast, ancient, soot-filled hall, a great fire was blazing in the middle of the stone floor. Smoke drifted along the ceiling, trying to find its way out. Soup was cooking in a big copper kettle, and hares and rabbits were turning on spits. "Tonight you'll sleep here, and with me, and all my little animals," said the robber girl. They ate and drank, and then went over to a corner where hay and blankets had been spread out. Overhead on laths and beams sat almost 100 doves that all seemed to be asleep, although they stirred a bit when the little girls approached. "They're all mine," said the little robber girl as she grabbed the nearest one, held it by its legs, and shook it so it flapped its wings. "Kiss it!" she cried, and fluttered it in Gerda's face. "There, sit, my wood rascals," she went on, pointing to a hole high up in the wall that had several bars fastened over it. "They're wood rascals, those 2 doves. They'd fly off in an instant if they weren't kept properly locked up. And here's my old sweetheart, Bay." She tugged on the antler of a reindeer who was tethered with a copper ring around its neck. "We have to keep him penned up or he'll run away. He's so scared of it. Or every single evening I tickle him on the neck with my sharp knife. He's so scared of it." So the little girl pulled a long knife out of a crack in the wall and let it slide along the reindeer's throat. The poor animal kicked his legs, and the robber girl laughed. Then she pulled Gerda along to bed. "Do you take your knife to bed with you?" asked Gerda, giving it a rather frightened look. "I always sleep with a knife," said the little robber girl. "You never know what might come along. But tell me again what you told me before about little Kai, and why you've gone into the whole wide world." And Gerda told her everything from the beginning. And the wood doves cooed up above in their cage, while the other doves slept. The little robber girl put one arm around Gerda's neck, held a knife in her other, and slept so noisily that you could clearly hear her. But Gerda couldn't sleep a wink. She didn't know whether she was going to live or die. The robbers sat around the fire, singing and drinking, and the robber hag was turning somersaults. Oh, what an awful sight that was for the little girl. Then the wood doves said, "Coo, coo, we've seen little Kai. A white hen was carrying his sled. He was sitting in the Snow Queen's carriage, which raced low over the forest. When we lay in our nest, she blew on all the fledglings, and they all died except the 2 of us. Coo, coo." "What's that you're saying up there?" called Gerda. "Where did the Snow Queen go? Do you know anything about it?" "She must have gone to Lapland, where there's always snow and ice. Just ask the reindeer who's tethered onto the rope." There's ice and snow. It's so blissful and grand," said the reindeer. "There you can bound freely through the great sparkling valleys. That's where the Snow Queen has her summer tent, but her permanent castle is up near the North Pole, on an island called Spitzenberg." "Oh, little Kai, Kai," sighed Gerda. "You'd better lay still now," said the robber girl, "or I'll stick my knife in your belly." In the morning, Gerda told her everything that the wood doves had said. The little robber girl gave her a somber look, but nodded her head and said, Never mind. Do you know where Lapland is?" she asked the reindeer. "Who would know better than I?" said the animal, and his eyes sparkled. That's where I was born and raised. That's where I bounded through the snowfields. Listen to me, said the little robber girl to Gerda. You can see that all our menfolk are gone, but Mother is still here, and she's going to stay. But later in the morning she'll take a drink from that big bottle, and then give herself a little nap. That's when I'm going to do something for you. And she jumped out of bed, threw her arms around her mother's neck, tugged on her beard, and said, My own sweet goat, good morning! And her mother pinched her nose until it turned red and blue, but all was done with affection. When her mother had taken a drink from her bottle and laid down for a little nap, the robber girl went over to the reindeer and said, I have a great urge to tickle you many more times with my sharp knife, because you're so amusing when I do that. But never mind, I'm going to untie your rope and help you outside so you can run off to Lapland. But you must be quick about it and take this little girl to the Snow Queen's castle, where her playmate is. I'm sure you've heard her story. She talked loud enough, and you're always eavesdropping. The reindeer leapt for joy. The robber girl picked up little Gerda and took the precautions of tying on her. She even gave her a little cushion to sit on. Never mind, she said. Here are your fur boots, because it would be cold. I'm keeping the muff. It's much too charming. But you're not going to freeze. Here's my mother's big knitted mittens. They'll reach all the way up to your elbows. Stick your hands in. Now your hands look just like my hideous mother's. And Gerda wept with joy. I don't like your sniveling, said the little robber girl. Try and look pleased. And here are 2 loaves of bread and a ham so you won't starve. Everything was tied onto the reindeer's back. The little robber girl opened the door and lured all the big dogs inside. Then she sliced through the rope with her knife and said to the reindeer, Run, but take good care of that little girl. And Gerda stretched out her hands in the big knitted mittens toward the robber girl to bid her farewell. Then the reindeer flew off over thickets and stumps, through the great forest, over marshes and steeps, as fast as he could. The wolves howled and the ravens shrieked. Crackle, crackle, said the sky. It looked as if it had a nosebleed. There are my northern lights, said the reindeer. Look how they shine. And then he kept on running night and day. The loaves of bread were eaten, the ham was too. And then they were in Lapland. Sixth story, The Lap Woman and the Finn Woman. They stopped at a little house. It was a pitiful hovel. The roof reached all the way to the ground, and the door was so low that the family had to crawl on their bellies to go in or out. No one was at home except an old Lap woman who was frying fish over a whale oil lamp. And the reindeer told her Gerda's whole story. But first he told his own story, because he thought it was much more important, and Gerda was so worn out from the cold that she couldn't even speak. Oh, you poor thing, said the Lap woman, and you still have a long way to go. You have traveled hundreds of miles through Finnmark, because that's where the Snow Queen lives, out in the country, burning blue lights with every single evening. I'm going to write a few words on a dried cod, because I have no paper, and then I'll give it to you to take along to the Finn woman up there. She could give you better directions than I can. After Gerda had warmed up and was given something to eat and drink, the Lap woman wrote a few words on a dried cod, told Gerda to take good care of it, tied her firmly to the reindeer again, and off he went. Crackle, crackle, it said up in the sky. All night long the loveliest blue northern lights blazed, and then they arrived in Finnmark and knocked on the Finn woman's chimney, because she had no door. It was so hot inside that even the Finn woman walked around almost naked. She was short and quite grimy looking. She unbuttoned little Gerda's clothes at once and pulled off her knitted mittens and boots, because otherwise she would have been too hot. She put up a piece of ice on top of the reindeer's head, and then read what was written on the dried cod. She read it 3 times until she knew it by heart, and then put the fish into her cooking pot, since it was edible after all, and she never wasted anything. The reindeer told first his own story, and then little Gerda's, and the Finn woman blinked her wise eyes, but didn't say a word. "You're so clever," said the reindeer. "I know you can tie up all the winds of the earth with a thread. When the skipper loosens one knot, he has a good wind. If he loosens another, a sharp wind blows. If he looses the third and fourth, then a storm rages so fiercely that the forests topple. Won't you give this little girl a potion to lend her the strength of 12 men so she can vanquish the Snow Queen?" "The strength of 12 men," said the Finn woman. "Yes, that should be enough." And then she went over to a shelf, took down a big rolled-up hide, and spread it out. Strange-looking letters were printed on it, and the Finn woman began reading so intently that sweat poured down her forehead. But the reindeer again pleaded earnestly for little Gerda, and Gerda, her eyes full of tears, gave the Finn woman such an imploring look that the woman began blinking once more, and drew the reindeer over to a corner to whisper to him as she put fresh ice on his head. "It's true that little Kai is with the Snow Queen. He thinks everything there is so his taste and liking, and he believes that it's the best place in the world, but that's because he has a splinter of glass in his heart and a tiny speck of glass in his eye. They have to be taken out, otherwise he will never be a human again, and the Snow Queen will keep her hold on him." "But can't you give little Gerda a little potion to drink so she can gain power over all that?" "It's true that little Kai is with the Snow Queen. He thinks everything there is to his taste and liking, and he believes that it's the best place in the world, but that's because he has a splinter of glass in his heart and a tiny speck of glass in his eye. They have to be taken out, otherwise he will never be a human again, and the Snow Queen will keep her hold on him forever." "But can't you give little Gerda a potion to drink, so she will gain power over all that?" "I can't give her any greater power than she already has. Don't you see how great it is? Don't you see how people and animals want to serve her? How she has come so far in the world in her bare feet? She must not learn of her power from us. It resides in her heart. It lies in the fact that she is a sweet and innocent child. If she can't reach the Snow Queen on her own and remove the glass from little Kai, there's nothing we can do to help her. 10 miles from here is the edge of the Snow Queen's garden. You can carry the little girl that far. Set her down near the big bush with the red berries on the snow. Don't chit-chatter for long, and hurry back here." Then the Finn woman lifted little Gerda onto the reindeer's back, who set off as fast as he could. "Oh, I forgot my boots! I forgot my mittens!" cried little Gerda. She could feel the sting of the cold, but the reindeer didn't stop. He ran until he came to the big bush with the red berries. That's where he set Gerda down and kissed her on the lips, and big, shining tears ran down the animal's cheeks. Then he ran back as fast as he could. There stood poor Gerda, with no shoes, with no gloves, in the middle of the terrible, ice-cold Finnmark. As she set off as fast as she could, then a whole regiment of snowflakes appeared, but they didn't fall from the sky, which was quite clear and glowing from the northern lights. The snowflakes were running along the ground, and the closer they came, the bigger they grew. Gerda remembered how big and artful they had seen when she looked at the snowflakes through the magnifying glass, but this time they were truly enormous and terrifying. They were alive. They were the Snow Queen's advance troops. They had the strangest shapes. Some looked like big, horrible porcupines, others like giant knots of snakes with writhing heads. Still others looked like fat little bears, with their fur sticking out all over. All of them were dazzling white. All of them were living snowflakes. Then little Gerda said the Lord's Prayer, and as the cold was so great that she could see her own breath, it came out of her mouth like a cloud of smoke. Her breath got thicker and thicker, forming into bright little angels that grew bigger and bigger as they touched the ground. All of them wore helmets on their heads and carried spears and shields in their hands. There were more and more of them, and by the time Gerda had finished saying the Lord's Prayer, there was an entire legion around her. They thrust their spears at the fearsome snowflakes, which shattered into hundreds of pieces, and little Gerda continued on, quite safe and undaunted. The angels patted her feet and hands, and then she didn't feel the cold as much. She walked briskly toward the Snow Queen's castle. But first, we must see how Kai is doing. It's true he wasn't thinking about little Gerda, and least of all, that she might be standing outside the castle. The seventh story. What happened at the Snow Queen's castle, and what happened afterward? These castle walls were made of drifting snow, and the windows and doors of razor-sharp winds. There were over 100 halls, all of them shaped by the drifting snow. The largest stretched for many miles. All of them were lit by the bright northern lights, and they were so vast, so empty, so icy cold, and so glittering. Never was there any merriment, not so much as a little bear dance when a gale blew in and the polar bears would walk on their hind legs to show off their elegant manners. Never a little card party, with snout slapping and paw tugging. Never a little coffee klatch held by the white fox ladies. Empty, vast, and cold were the halls of the Snow Queen. The northern lights flared so precisely that it was possible to count when they would be at their height and when they would be at their lowest. In the middle of the endless, empty snow hall was a frozen lake. It was cracked into thousands of pieces, but each piece was exactly like all the others, and that was quite a feat. In the center sat the Snow Queen whenever she was home, and then she would say that she was sitting on the mirror of reason, that it was one of a kind and the best thing in the world. Little Kai was quite blue with cold. In fact, he was almost black. Yet he didn't notice because she had kissed the shivers out of him, and his heart was practically a lump of ice. He was dragging around several sharp, flat pieces of ice, which he placed in every imaginable way, trying to make a pattern out of them. It was just like when the rest of us take little wooden tiles and put them together to make shapes, called the Chinese puzzle game. Kai was also making shapes, the most ingenious of all. It was the ice game of reason. To his eyes, the shapes were quite splendid, and of the most importance. That was the work of the speck of glass in his eye. He created whole shapes that formed words, but he never could figure out how to form the one word he was looking for, the word eternity. And the Snow Queen had said, "If you can create that shape for me, then you will be your own master, and I will give you the whole world and a new pair of skates." But he couldn't do it. "Now I've got to dash off to the warm countries," said the Snow Queen. "I want to go out and peer into the black cauldrons." She meant the fire-spurting mountains of Etna and Vesuvius, as they're called. "I need to whitewash them a bit. It's only proper. It would look so good on top of all those lemons and grapes." And then the Snow Queen flew off, and Kai was left all alone in the vast, empty ice hall that went on for miles. He looked at the pieces of ice and thought so hard that his mind groaned. So stiff and still did he sit that he'd almost think he'd be frozen to death. That's when little Gerda entered the castle through the huge portal, which was made of razor-sharp winds. But she said an evening prayer, and then the winds died down as if they wanted to sleep, and she stepped inside the vast, empty, cold halls. Then she saw Kai. She recognized him, and she threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight and crying, "Kai, sweet little Kai, I've found you at last." But there he sat, quite motionless, stiff and cold. Then little Gerda wept hot tears. They fell on his breast and seeped into his heart. They thawed out the lump of ice and dissolved the little shard of mirror inside. He looked at her, and she sang the hymn, "In the valley where roses grow wild, there we will speak to the Christ child." Then Kai burst into tears. He wept so hard that the speck of mirror rolled out of his eye. He recognized her and rejoiced. "Gerda, sweet little Gerda, where have you been all this time? And where have I been?" He looked all around. "How cold is it here? How empty and vast is it here?" He hugged Gerda tight, and she laughed and cried with joy. It was so blissful that even the pieces of ice began to dance around them with joy. When the pieces grew tired and lay down to rest, they were lying in precisely the shape of the letters the Snow Queen had told Kai to create, so he would be his own master, and she would give him the whole wide world and a new pair of skates. Gerda kissed his cheeks, and they bloomed. She kissed his eyes, and they shone like her own. She kissed his hands and feet, and he grew strong and healthy. The Snow Queen was welcome to come home. His release lay spelled out before them in glittering pieces of ice, and they took each other by the hand and wandered out of the enormous castle. They talked about grandmother and about the roses on a roof, and wherever they went the winds lay perfectly still and the sun broken through. When they reached the bush with the red berries, the reindeer stood there, waiting. He had brought along another young reindeer, whose udder was full, and she gave the children her warm milk and kissed them on the lips. Then they carried Kai and Gerda first to the Finn woman's house, where they warmed themselves in the hot room and received directions from their homeward journey. Then on the Lapp woman, who had sewn new clothes for them and made ready her sleigh. And the reindeer and his young companion ran alongside and accompanied them to the very border of the country, where the first green sprouts were peeking out. That's where they bid farewell to the reindeer and the Lapp woman. "Farewell," they all said, and the first little birds began to chirp. The forest had green buds, and out of the woods, riding a magnificent horse that Gerda recognized, it had been harnessed to the golden carriage, came a young girl with a shimmering red cape on her head and pistols in front. It was the little robber girl who had grown tired of staying home. It was now on her way north, though later, if it didn't please her, she might head for other parts. She recognized Gerda at once. Gerda recognized her, and they both rejoiced. "You're a strange fellow, that way you tramp around," she said to little Kai. "I wonder if you really deserve to have someone running to the ends of the earth for your sake." But Gerda patted her on the cheek and asked about the prince and princess. "They're off to the foreign lands," said the robber girl. "What about the little crow?" asked little Gerda. "Oh, the crow is dead," she replied. "His tame sweetheart is a widow now, and she walks around with a scrap of black woolen yarn on her leg. She mourns so pitifully, and it's all nonsense. But tell me how things have gone for you, and how you managed to find him." So Gerda and Kai told her the story. "Well, snap, snip, snur, snap, lap," said the robber girl, and she took them both by the hand and promised that if she ever passed through their city, she would come to visit them. Then she strode off into the wide world, but Kai and Gerda walked hand in hand. And as they walked, a lovely spring arrived with flowers and greenery. The church bells chimed, and they recognized the tall towers in the big city. This was where they lived. They walked through the city and over to grandmother's door, up the stairs into the room where everything stood exactly as it had before. And the clock went tick, tick, and its hands were moving. But as they stepped through the door, they noticed that they had grown up. The roses on the eaves of the roof were blossoming in the open windows, and there stood their little childhood stools. Kai and Gerda sat down on them and held each other's hands. They had forgotten all about the cold, empty splendor of the Snow Queen's castle, as if it had been a bad dream. Grandmother was sitting in God's bright sunshine and reading aloud from the Bible. "Unless you have become a little child, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." And Kai and Gerda looked in each other's eyes, and all of a sudden they understood the old hymn. "In the valley where roses grow wild, there we speak to the Christ child." There they sat, two grown-ups, and yet they were children at heart. And it was summer, warm, blissful summer. The end. All right, my little ones, it's bedtime. I love you. I'll see you in the morning. Good night.